Live from London, this is BBC News. Multiple deaths and injuries reported after a blast at the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. The Hamas-run health ministry says at least 50 people have been killed, and it blames Israeli airstrikes. Israel is yet to comment. The United Nations again calls for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow aid into Gaza.
Gaza has become a graveyard for children. It's a living hell for everyone else.
The BBC's Luce Doucet sits down with Israel's president, with concern rising at the growing death toll in Gaza.
Nearly 70% are women and children. Why have they had to pay the price?
Well, nobody wants them to pay the price, God forbid. My heart goes out truly.
Hello, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Welcome to the Daily Global, where we bring you the top stories from around the world. We come on air tonight as the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says an air raid on Jabalia in the north of the Strip has killed at least 50 people and left hundreds trapped under the rubble. The buildings hit formed part of the Jabalia refugee camp. Before the war, it was home to more than 100,000 people, many of whom have been there for generations, since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Hamas, designated as a terrorist organisation by the UK government, has blamed Israel for the attack. Israel is yet to comment. Well, we can now go live to Jerusalem, where we're joined by our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams. Paul, let's start by talking about what's happened in Jabalia. You know the area very well. OK, well, Marwan Jalani, Director General of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, thank you very much for speaking to us at a very busy time. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Now, in a short while, we expect to be hearing from the Israel Defense Forces spokesperson Daniel Hagari. That's the podium there. We will, of course, bring that to you when it begins. It's his daily briefing where he updates people on what the Israeli military position is. So we will bring you that when we get it. Meanwhile, in the past hour, Hamas has said it's told mediators it will release some foreign captives in the coming days. The comments were made in a video on its Telegram account. Public pressures growing on Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to secure the release of the more than 230 hostages being held. They were taken on the 7th of October when Hamas attacked Israel, killing about 1,400 people. Our Middle East correspondent Lucy Williamson has been talking to one man whose family was taken from Kibbutz Be'eri and who says Israel should do whatever it takes to free them. A warning, her report contains flashing imaging. The President of Israel has spoken to the BBC's chief international correspondent, Luce Doucet. Isaac Herzog said Israel was now a different nation at a time of unprecedented agony. The President said his meetings with families of hostages were the most difficult he's had in his life and emphasised that Israel was doing everything it could to bring the more than 200 hostages home. He also said no progress has been made with negotiations. President Herzog was speaking after UN officials raised the alarm at the Security Council about rising civilian casualties in Gaza. Now, that's something which Luce put to President Herzog. We will bring you that interview shortly, but I think we're now going to cross live to the Israeli defense spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, who is delivering his evening statement.
And when the time comes, we can discuss things. So thank you very much and good evening.
Well, that's just concluded the regular news conference from the IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari there. Meanwhile, some other breaking news that has also come into us this evening. Firstly, we've now heard that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has spoken in a phone call to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a statement that says from Downing Street that the two men spoke this afternoon. Mr. Sunak told Mr. Netanyahu of the importance of taking all possible measures to minimise civilian casualties. The statement from Downing Street goes on to say the Prime Minister stressed the importance of rapidly increasing the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza and welcomed Israel's commitment to facilitate significantly more deliveries. He said the UK would support all efforts to ensure life-saving aid reaches those in need, including temporary humanitarian pauses. The statement goes on to say that the Prime Minister reiterated the UK's resolute backing for Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, while emphasising the importance of taking all possible measures to minimise civilian casualties. He goes on to say that the UK is focused on securing the safe return of hostages and urgently ensuring British nationals and others can leave Gaza via the Rafah crossing or other routes. So that's a basic summary of the statement. It goes on to say that the leaders also discuss the situation in the West Bank and the long-term goal of a two-state solution. And that statement's come into us from Downing Street. Also, we are getting news in that the Rafah crossing may be opening for some people who need hospital treatment in Egypt. I'll have more information on that in a moment. That news was just coming into us in the last few moments, that some people will be, according to reports that are just coming in, able to leave Gaza via the Rafah crossing for urgent medical treatment. But I'm just trying to get more information on that. We'll be back on that in a moment. Well, as we heard in that press briefing, the IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari has confirmed that Israeli fighter jets carried out the attack on the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, which he said killed a senior commander and caused the collapse of Hamas's underground infrastructure. As Israel steps up its offensive, it says it's hitting the underground tunnel network in Gaza, which belongs to Hamas. But let's look at more about what these tunnels are and why they are so important in this conflict. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera explains more. Ed Arnold, thank you very much for taking us through some of the military analysis on the ongoing conflict. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Well, earlier in this hour, we mentioned that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had a phone conversation with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, Downing Street is now saying that Mr. Sunak also spoke to the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, earlier today. They've shared some details. It says in this statement that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak told Mahmoud Abbas that the UK would continue to support diplomatic action to protect Palestinian civilians, prevent wider escalation and secure a peaceful and lasting resolution to the crisis. So in the course of the day, we now have confirmation that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has spoken to both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority. Of course, diplomatic movements continue as all world leaders try and de-escalate the ongoing conflict. Well, let's stay with that. And the war between Israel and Hamas fighters who stormed Israeli towns and kibbutzes from the Gaza Strip on the 7th of October is the latest in 7 decades of conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, which has destabilized the wider Middle East.
From any consequences for it. And I think that's something that's being thought about in Washington these days. OK,
thank you so much, Stephen Cook and Dr. Sanam Vakil, for bringing us some wider context on our main story. Stay with us here on BBC News. I'll be back after a short break. Live from London, this is BBC News. Israel confirms an attack on the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. It says it killed a Hamas leader. The Hamas-run health ministry says at least 50 people were killed in the raid. The United Nations again calls for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow aid into Gaza.
Gaza has become a graveyard for children. It's a living hell for everyone else.
The UK COVID inquiry hears from two of Boris Johnson's closest former advisers who deliver a scathing assessment of how the COVID crisis was handled.
So I would say overall, widespread failure, but pockets of excellent people and pockets of excellent teams doing excellent work within an overall dysfunctional system.
Hello, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Welcome to the Daily Global, where we bring you the top stories from around the world. Israel's confirmed that it hit the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. It says it was targeting and killed one of the Hamas leaders responsible for the October 7th attacks. The Hamas-run Gazan health ministry says at least 50 people were killed, with hundreds injured. The Palestinian Red Crescents told this programme at least 25 civilians were killed. Images from the scene show people trying to rescue others trapped under the rubble. Before the war, the camp, made up of high-rise buildings, was home to more than 100,000 people, many of whom have been there for generations since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. BBC Verify have located the exact position of the blast. You can see it here, and you can see how built up that area is. Well, let's get more on that now from our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, and a warning that his report contains imagery that you may find distressing. Paul Adams in Jerusalem, thank you very much for the moment. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. The official COVID inquiry in the UK has heard that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson believed older people should have been allowed to catch the disease so younger people could get on and boost the economy. A diary entry from the then Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, said Mr Johnson was obsessed with the idea. With more on all of that, here's our political editor, Chris Mason. Azadeh Mashiri there. Well, we have plenty more on all of the day's news on the BBC News website. We are, of course, running a live page on the UK's COVID inquiry and, of course, the developments in the Middle East. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. I'll be back after a short break, so do stay with us here on BBC News.
iPlayer.
This is BBC News, the headlines. Israel confirms an attack on the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. It says it killed a Hamas leader. The Hamas-run health ministry says at least 50 people were killed in that raid. The World Health Organization warns of a public health catastrophe in Gaza as the United Nations again calls for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow aid in. The BBC's Lise Doucette sits down with Israel's president, with concern rising at the growing death toll in Gaza.
Nearly 70% are women and children. So why have they had to pay the price?
Nobody wants them to pay the price, God forbid. My heart goes out truly.
King Charles says there's no excuse for colonial abuses in Kenya. He addressed crowds during a state banquet in the East African nation, his first visit to a Commonwealth country since becoming king. King Charles expressed his greatest sorrow and deepest regret for the atrocities suffered by Kenyans during their struggle for independence, but stopped short of making a full apology for one of the British Empire's bloodiest insurgencies. More than 10,000 people were killed and many others were tortured. In 2013, the UK compensated more than 5,000 people in a deal worth £20 million. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK.
Zach is Will's Week.
You're live with BBC News. The Israeli President Isaac Herzog has strongly defended Israel's military operations in Gaza, insisting Israel was doing its best to limit civilian casualties but had to target Hamas infrastructure, including homes, because Hamas was using them to launch rockets into Israel. Israel's coming under mounting international criticism for the rising civilian death toll in Gaza and a growing humanitarian crisis. While the president was speaking to our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette in Jerusalem. Sorry to stop you there. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Shaista Aziz, who's resigned from the Labour Party. You're watching BBC News. Now, as we've been reporting earlier in the programme, Saudi Arabia is set to host the men's 2034 World Cup after Australia decided against bidding to stage the tournament. Here's our sports correspondent Dan Roan on reactions to this latest development. Now, just before we go, let's bring you some news that's coming into us from the United States. The US Senate has confirmed Jack Lew as the US ambassador to Israel. The Senate's voted to confirm with 53 yes and 43 against, so that nomination has been confirmed. And you may remember that name because Jack Lew was a former Treasury Secretary in the United States. Well, we have more on that story and all the latest developments from the Middle East on the BBC website. We're running a live page on that story. Christian's up next. I'm Rajini. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello there. The rain in Northern Ireland has eased, but in 24